he sent it to me, Father Clone all the time. And over the years, I embarrassed myself quite a few times. And, make a mistake, it's all lead and preach and everything else. But I'm happy God kind of let me progress with that. We're gonna, continue our study of the book of Daniel. Today we're going to be looking at the chapter 8, the ram and the male goat. And we may finish it up next week. I'm not sure we'll be able to put that into one lesson. But again, we'll do it again for the time. I would be very remiss if I didn't again thank Mr. Allen. This guy is so wonderful. I'm studying, all the time trying to get these lessons done early. And I just take pictures. I pick out these maps and charts and stuff, and I take pictures of them on my phone and send them to him. He has to move them around, and he does a wonderful job. So enjoy the lesson. You got to give him a lot of credit. Now, we talked about this divided kingdom being the background for the prophets. Now, there's a lot of prophets mentioned in the Bible. There's hundreds of prophets, and even in the New Testament. Prophets, but when we refer to this, we have 17 books that are contributed to the prophets. And so this is really the background here. And 12 of the prophets were preaching during this time. He was preaching to Judah or the nation of Israel. Sometimes they even a couple of books, about Jonah and Nahum. They were sent to Assyria. And we said that all these prophets, the pattern was that they spoke to the people of their time, and they addressed either Judah or Israel or some of the surrounding neighbors, but they also always looked forward to the coming of Christ and the spiritual kingdom. So you had the 12 prophets that prophesied during this time of the divided kingdom. In Babylon, you had 2 prophets, Daniel and Ezekiel. And then after the captivity, you only had 3 prophets, had Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Haggai and Zechariah were the ones that kind of spurred the people on to go ahead and complete the building of the temple. And Haggai and Zechariah are mentioned prominently in Ezra and Nehemiah, and their role in encouraging the people. Now, what we've studied so far in the first 7 chapters of Daniel is we've seen that God revealed through Daniel that from the time of his Babylonian captivity, it's the coming of Christ, establishing the spiritual kingdom, that there's going to be 4 great world empires. There's going to be Babylon, there's going to be Persia, Greece, and then Rome. It says in the days of the Roman Empire, God's going to set up his kingdom, so it never be destroyed. Now, things change at this focus, though, because now, in this chapter 8, he forgets about Babylon, he doesn't get into Rome yet. He's just going to focus on the 2 middle empires, because talk about the Persian and the Greeks. And the only way that Babylon is really mentioned is in the first verse of chapter 8. He says, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. Now, we've mentioned before that these visions and dreams, these things are not chronological, same way like in the Revelation. Revelation is actually a cyclical book. And we know that it's not chronological, so Belshazzar, we already studied about his death back in chapter 5. But then last week, when we looked at chapter 7, they said it was in the 1st year of Belshazzar that Daniel had this vision. Now it was in the 3rd year of his reign that he had this vision. And this vision is going to be about the ram and the he-goat. So we'll look at chapter 8. And we look at a couple of these charts. First, we're going to look at the chart of that really can see how important these periods are of the Persian, the Greek period. The Persians, of course, they're going to come to power in 536, and that's when they're going to allow the Jewish people to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. Of course, most of the Jews stayed scattered out in the Gentile world. But the guy by the name of Zerubbabel, who was a descendant of David, he was made governor by the king of Persia, and he led a group of 50 thousand back. And then we had the time of Haggai, Zechariah, the time of Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. And that ends the biblical writing, and now we get into the period of what's called the biblical science. And this is a time when the Greeks are going to start to develop over in Macedonian Greece. From these times of Spartans, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the uniting of the Greek state. But this Persian Empire, although it says it covered the last bit, 100 years, it was from 536 to 430. So it covered about the last 100 years of biblical history, that it's going to last for another 100 years. So the Persians are going to rule the world for 200 years. And then when the Greeks come to power, they're going to rule the world for 300 years. Almost from 336 and not till the time of 63 that Rome began to be prominent. Let's see that next chart. This is just an analogy of some of the Persian kings, and you'll recognize some of these from the scriptures. Like Cyrus, we know that he's the one that in 336 that issued that decree allowing the people to return back to Palestine, and that's recorded in the book of Second Chronicle, and also in the first part of Ezra, we have his decree. This Cambius, he's the one that stopped the rebuilding of Jerusalem in the time of Ezra. Darius the first. Again, he was the Persian emperor at the time. Haggai and Zechariah referred the people to complete the temple. Xerxes was the one mentioned in the story of Esther. And then Artaxerxes, this was in the time that Ezra and Nehemiah, of course, returned to help the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and then, of course, come to Malachi, and then the same time. Well, they continued on having these different Persian kings. And the last was Darius the third, and he was a very powerful king, but he's the one that's going to be defeated by the Greeks. Now, in the meantime, history is an important thing. There's so much overlap going on, because you can have things happening at the same time. Like, it's fascinating to me. At the same time that the Roman Empire was being established, the Chinese had an even more impressive empire over the Far East that nobody even knew about. Because these things were happening simultaneously. So as the period of the Persians is going to be coming to a close, we're going to see the Greeks start to rise. Now, there's going to be a lot of fighting among the Greeks themselves, and the Greeks are going to defeat the Persians. This is what we're going to look at a map later, and I said that's what you can't understand about the greed of human beings. So the Persian Empire stretched from India all the way through what's modern-day Turkey, but they kept trying to cross the sea, you can see there, they're trying to cross the Greece and Macedonia. And of course, in 490 is when the Greeks defeated them at the Battle of Marathon. Does that sound familiar? That's where one of the survivors ran 26 miles to tell the news of the battle and fell dead, but that's where we did our marathon. We're going to 26 miles. And so this you see something, they talk about the golden age of Greece, that they're just becoming a more organized people. We know they're very warlike people. They're Peloponnesian Wars is the time Athens and Sparta. So they battled among themselves for a long time, but the Spartans eventually came out dominant. And as we saw in the other chart as well, the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. It said that Aristotle, that one of his pupils was Alexander the Great. And although the Greek states were so divided, but his father, Philip of Macedonia, he organized the Greek state. So he kind of really made it possible for Alexander to become this great later king that he was. So we're going to look at what this chapter 8 describes. When he talks about this ram and the he-goat. In verse 2, he said, I saw in the vision, and so it was while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is the province of Elam, and I saw the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw there was standing beside the river was a ram which had two horns, and the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other. The higher one came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, and so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there anything that could deliver from his hand. And he did according to his will, and became great. That's the description of the Persian Empire. Remember in the last vision we saw, where Daniel stood on the seashore and he saw these beasts coming out of the sea. Or the first beast was the lion of Babylon, and the second beast he said was a bear, and he said it was raised up on one side. So here, when you're having a ram, he said he had two horns, but one was higher. Because when they defeated Babylon, it was the Medes of Persia, the Medo-Persian Empire. But later, the Persians were more dominant, and later years it became known as the Persian Empire. And this is how, again, you're going to interpret these biblical visions. These prophets always see these dramatic things, but these are things that are fulfilled in the normal course of history. And but God does it this way, and He uses a symbolic language. But if we know the Bible, we know what He's talking about. So this is definitely the Persian Empire, and really this is one of the easiest chapters. Later, you're going to call him by name anyway. But we know, even if He didn't call him by name, we would know just from the description. But then there's another character, the male goat. He said, and as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and he ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the lamb, and he moved with rage against him and attacked the ram and broke his horn. There was no power in the ram to withstand him. He was cast to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in its place came up four notable horns. Once again, we don't have to guess. So if you jump down to verse 20, he says specifically, he said, the ram which you saw having two horns, they are the kings of the Medes and Persians. And in 21, he said, and the male goat is the kingdom of the Greeks. The large horn that saw between its eyes is his first king. And as for the broken horn, and the four that stood up in its place, four kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. Okay, so let's look at this map now. This is taken from I got a book at home called Greek and Romans, Builders of Our World, and it has this chart in there. And see, when you describe the ram that had two horns, he said that he was pushing westward and northward and southward. So that's the Persian. But then when he talked about the Greek coming, he said that he came and he pushed eastward, northward, southward. And again, look at the description. They said he described this goat as a goat that's touching off the ground. Well, what did we see in the last chapter? He saw the beast coming out of the sea. The third beast, he said, I saw a leopard with four wings. So the Greek Empire was always described, but Alexander defeated a much larger army, but with his small split force. So what happened is that when Alexander crossed the Macedonia into what's modern day Turkey, he won a series of battles, but in many places the people received them readily. With the Greek people, what they brought to the world was a culture. When they came to a new place, they established schools and libraries, and of course they had gymnasiums. Now the problem they had with the Jewish people is because they, of course, they worshiped the different gods, different idols, and also they had things like the Olympic Games, and when they did that, they participated naked. Well, the Jewish people, that wasn't going to go over too well. But in the cultures, they welcome these Greek rulers. So they've been under Persians for 200 years because the Greeks really let them be their own. Let them do their own thing as long as they follow the Greek culture. Now, this is referred to, and I'll mention that in the New Testament, Hellenized Jews. These were Jewish people who had accepted Greek culture, and that became a struggle in biblical times in this period between the Testament and even in New Testament times. They still had some Jewish people who wanted to accept that Greek culture. And so Alexander was this small army. He finally met up with Darius in this little place here called the Cilician Gate. And that was a narrow pass. And the Persians tried to outflank him, but Alexander just never able to outmaneuver Darius and defeat him. And Darius was going to flee and leave the Greeks there. Let's see if we got another. We'll go back to the map. But this is a mosaic that represents this particular battle. This is, you see the bare head. This is Alexander Great. So many mosaic tiles missing. That represents Alexander, and this represents Darius. But once again, Darius is going to flee from that battle. Go back to the map. Okay. So once Alexander had routed the Persians, he continued coming down into the land of Palestine. And there was an interesting battle fought here in Lebanon, and it had to do with the city of Tyre. Now, this area in biblical times was the area of Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were very famous seafaring people. Even modern scholars talk about how they went out in the Mediterranean, even up in the Atlantic. They reached far off places. But biblically, when you think of the Phoenicians, there's two main cities, the cities of Tyre and Sidon. And they're often described, the seaport cities, sailors, they're called out of the wicked and their sin. But that the city of Tyre had been, of course, conquered by the Assyrians and later the Babylonians and then the Persians. Well, by the time Alexander got down there, they had built some capital like Tyre, the city on an island, out in the Mediterranean. Now the prophets had predicted when they were calling for the downfall of Tyre, they said it would become a place for spreading the net. Well, if you look at the one more, this is modern day Tyre off the Lebanon coast. But what happened? Alexander and his men, this is how diligent. It took 7 months. But they took the ruins of their old city and built a causeway out to that island, and they conquered Tyre. But and so it's amazing we still see remnants of that today. Of course, it's been built up now by more sand, water, but that actually was the result. Let's go back now to the map. And so Alexander came down, and interestingly, he did not conquer Jerusalem. Now, there's nothing in the Bible that tells us why, but we'll refer to the writing. You may have heard of a name by the name of Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian who lived in New Testament times. So he's going to be a direct eyewitness of the start of Jerusalem. Now, this guy, Flavius Josephus, he was actually a Jewish priest, and he was fighting for Jewish independence until he went to Rome. And once he got to Rome and he saw how magnificent, he knew that any hope of overthrowing Rome was disputable. And so from that time, they changed his name to Flavius, and he even accompanied the emperor and Titus when Titus came to restore Jerusalem. But he was really commissioned to write the history of the Jews, which he did. He goes back, even talks about creation, and he goes all the way through Jewish history. And then I said his most valuable importance is that he was an eyewitness to the destruction of Jerusalem. But there's been a reference, I'm going to offer this up, it's not in the scripture, this is a story that's found in Josephus. It says that the priest, the high priest, when they knew that Alexander was coming, that he arrayed himself in his priestly garment, the other priests all dressed in white, and they came out to meet Alexander. And the story is that Alexander said he was back in his homeland, considering attacking Persia. That God spoke to him in a vision and said, "Go, you go." And we know that there's many times in the Old Testament that God did communicate with different kings. So in the book of Josephus, so that's the reason that he did not destroy Jerusalem. In fact, they took him in to the temple, even allowed him to offer a sacrifice. And it said they showed him the book of Daniel, where it predicted that the Greeks would overthrow the Persians. So once Alexander passed through Palestine, came and of course conquered Egypt and established the famous city, Alexandria. Alexandria was a very important city. You may have heard of the Great Library. Alexandria tragically burned. I said we don't know how much knowledge was lost. But there's also was a famous lighthouse built there that's listed as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So that's one, the lighthouse in Alexandria. And even this continued even in New Testament time, because the 3 great cities were Rome, Alexandria, Egypt, and then the city of Antioch, which is up there in Syria. That's going to be very, very important. That's the continued study. So after he had subdued Egypt, Alexander went up to the Caucasus, modern day Syria, Iraq. He finally met Darius again, where the Persian army was officially beaten and destroyed. I think Darius was able to escape again, and later he was killed by one of his own men. And after he was killed by his own men, later Alexander would take care of that guy. But the army they're going to come here like to come down to Babylon and spend a month resting, and then they're going to go ahead and continue their conquering throughout what is Iran, Afghanistan, and again they're going to go clear to the borders of India, to the Indus River, and that's where they're going to fight their last battle. There's another picture. This is what they came in. You know how here it is, that they had war elephants. And this is the last battle, but by this point, and keep in mind, it had been 10 years since they left Macedonia. And they were tired. They said, Alexander, we want to go home. We'll go back to the map. So it said that Alexander actually pouted for a while. He wanted to continue to conquer. But he did finally listen to his men, and some went by land, and some went by sea. And they finally came to Babylon. There it says that Alexander got a fever and died. He wasn't yet 33. But he began conquering when he was 22 years old. And when he was only 32, he died in Babylon. There's one of the scriptures that we have here in Daniel chapter 8, which describes this goat that touched off the ground. It has a notable form. It said that when he was strong, that form was broken and 4 horns came up in its place. Well, that's what's going to happen. As the Persians are going to rule for 200 and the Greeks for 300, see, Alexander only had a short time. But then, once he died, his kingdom is divided up among his 4 generals. Cassander took the homeland of Macedonia. A guy by the name of Seleucus, he took Thrace and part of Asia Minor there. And the rest of the empire, the Seleucid generals were here in Syria, and the Ptolemies were in Egypt. And that's, for biblical purposes, that's what's most important. We kind of this Cassander, like Seleucus, they're kind of off the map. But the Seleucid rulers and the Ptolemies are important. And as you go to the book of Daniel, when they refer to the king of the north and the king of the south, this is what we're going to be talking about. And so this is going to go on. But if you look at, Daniel is making these predictions here before the Persian comes to power, was in the reign of Babylonian king. But he's talking about events that are going to happen, hundreds of years in the future. And so that's what he's describing. And there's another aspect of this chapter 8 that has to do with it, a little similar to what we saw in chapter 7. chapter 7, when we saw those four beasts coming out of the ground, he described a little horn. And that little horn was going to be the represent a period of persecution for God's people. And so we know that first little horn, we know he came from the fourth kingdom. You go back to what we saw in Daniel chapter 7, 23 to 25. He says, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which is Rome, which shall be different from all the other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it and break in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall rise from this kingdom, and another one shall rise after them, and he will be different from the first one, and he shall subdue 3 kings, and he shall speak pompous words against the Most High. He shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and he shall intend to change times and laws, and the saints shall be given to his hands for a time, and half time. So that persecution that's described in chapter 7 was fulfilled here when the Romans persecuted the Jewish people and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. But in chapter 8, he's talking about a little horn that's going to rise in this period between the Testaments, after the Greeks had taken over, once Alexander died and been given among his 4 generals. If you go back and look at this little horn, go back to Daniel 8, verse 9. He said, and now one of them came up with a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the glorious land, and grew up to the host of heaven, and was cast down from the host of heaven, and some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of hosts, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army shall be given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifice. And he cast truth down to the ground, and he did all this and prospered. Well, if you look over then in verse 23, he's again describing this little horn. He said, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having a fierce feature, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy fearfully, he shall prosper and thrive, and he shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. And through his cunning he shall cause the seats to prosper under his rule. He shall exalt himself in his heart, and he shall destroy many of their posterity, and he shall even rise up against the princes of princes, but he shall be broken without human hand. Now, you might say, it's hard. Look how hard it was in Daniel, verse 27. He said, by Daniel fainted and was sick for days. He said, and then I rose and went about the king's business, and I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood. So Daniel was seeing these things, well, in the last days of Babylon, but he's talking about things that have happened 100 years at the end, not only after the Persian period, but also the Greek period. The interpretation is that there he's going to come up in the latter days. Well, there's only one person in history that fits this description. I say it's very complicated. In some of the book of Daniel, we're going to talk about the battle between the Seleucid rulers and the Ptolemy rulers. Again, different times we're going to fight for control over God's people stuck there in the middle. For the most part, the Ptolemies were pretty peaceful. They let the Jewish people kind of continue. And many of the Syrians rulers did the same thing. But at the end, right at the end, a guy rose up, Antiochus IV. Now, it's no wonder in the New Testament, right there, that city is called Antioch. They get the same from these Syrian rulers. It's Antiochus. This is Antiochus IV. He took the name Epiphanes. That means God manifest. And what's the that scripture that he's going to exalt himself up, raise himself even above. So he tried to act like a deity. Now, I'm watching videos of the comical thing that people use another Greek name. He called himself Epiphany, God meant that it was another very similar word that meant madman. So although he saw himself as a god, the people saw him as a madman. Well, since there were all these battles between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids under Antioch, he was finally able to come down and conquer the Ptolemies, and he was ready to take Egypt. This is the problem. Because of Rome. It comes down. This whole background, Cleopatra, and all that. What happened is Antiochus had captured the island of Cyprus, and he had captured Egypt. Well, one of the Egyptian emissaries was there in Egypt. He took his cane and drew a circle around Antiochus in the sand. And he said, I want you to withdraw from Cyprus, withdraw from Egypt. If you step on that circle without doing so, you're at war with Rome. Well, he might have been a madman and pretty egotistical, but he knew better. So he agreed to withdraw from Cyprus and to withdraw from Egypt. And so after all these years, he finally reached the goal of conquering Egypt, and I had to give it up to the Romans. So on his way home, he took his fury out on the Jewish people. And every time he killed people, they offered, he was very pro Greek. He wanted them to accept the Greek culture. So this is where they offered swine on all their altars. Then he went to Jerusalem himself. They said 80 people were taken, 40,000 were killed, 40,000 were taken as prisoners. He went in and, of course, defiled the temple. He dedicated they took all the furnishings of the Jewish people and dedicated that temple to Jupiter, the god of the Greeks, and offered the pig meat, and he stopped the daily sacrifice. And this went on for 3 years. Now, he unfortunately conquered, he went back to Syria, but he would have his men continue to come down whenever something happened. He had to send armies down. But he himself didn't go, and if you notice that the last it said that he'll fall, but not by human hand. You see that in there? But what had happened at the end of his reign, he had a rebellion out here in the eastern part of the empire. So Antiochus had to go, and he went and he subdued all the enemies that got this all under his control again. And on the way back, kind of like Alexander, he caught a fever and died. So he died without human hand. What happened to the Jewish people is they had put up with this for 3 years without daily sacrifice. But there was a priest, Matthias, Maccabee. He had 5 sons. Have you heard about the Maccabean rebellion? So what they did, they rose up and became like guerrilla fighters in his own town. One of these Greek leaders was trying to make them offer pig meat, and he refused to do it. When another guy stepped forward to do it, he killed that guy and killed the Syrian, and then they went into the mountains and it became like a guerrilla warfare. And so for these 3 years, they held out in the mountains, and they would go and attack these Syrian forces. But of course, eventually the Syrians were forced to withdraw as the Romans became more prominent. And so the Maccabees were able to go back to Jerusalem, cleanse the temple, reinstate the daily sacrifice. And that's what they still celebrate today, every December, known as Hanukkah. So what the Jews celebrate on is a celebration of what happened. And so, once again, you see that you have to take all these Bible visions independently. Because in chapter 7, the little horn is going to represent something that happened in New Testament times, which we're going to talk about that more next time we go. But then the little horn in chapter 8 is clearly occurred during the time of the Persians and the Greeks. Between the tests. So that's the lesson this morning that I have for you. And I said it, we're just so fortunate. You know, Daniel, when he saw these things, he was so overwhelmed, like that he collapsed. You see, we're so fortunate that we sit at this time in modern day history that so we can look back and understand the events. We got charts, we got maps, we got videos. I watch videos on any other. They tell you all of this. And that's another important thing that we talked about this, is the Bible is not a book of history. But the history that's here is accurate. And there's been so many other kingdoms and things that have risen and fallen and wars have been fought. The reason these things are covered is because they're part of God's plan to bring Christ into the world. And that's why God revealed it to Daniel, so that they would understand, even in that period of time, what was going to happen. So it's all part of God's plan to eventually bring Christ into the world and to establish that spiritual kingdom. And the last thing we have up here is this is a quote from Josephus, and that shows you that, and this is just to show that this interpretation is rightful interpretation. Many people today, they try to take these visions and stuff in the Old Testament and put it in some future time. I tell people that too. I said, if you have a line representing all human history, you got to realize we're just a dot. That's fine. But to think everything written in the Bible revolves around us, it's pretty arrogant. But this is what Josephus had written. He said, indeed, it came to pass, and he's talking about the troubles that's going to come, the temple being spoiled and all that. He said, indeed, all this came to pass on our nation. Our nation, he referred to the Jewish people. He said he suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes, according to Daniel's vision, and what he wrote many years before they came to pass. And in the very same manner, Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government, and that our country should be made desolate by them. So, Josephus again confirmed that these two little horns represent the persecution, not only of under Syrians, but also of Rome. So we'll pick up there next time we're together. With chapter 9 is fascinating. The fascinating part of that is going to be the 70 weeks that we today.